Puzzle platformers are a rare breed these days, but in the 90s they were, well, still quite rare actually. Nevertheless, a few games left a lasting impression, such as Blizzard's The Lost Vikings, which saw you controlling 3 Nordic chaps in silly hats as they escape from an alien spaceship for some reason.
Aliens probably abducted Vikings all the time. I expect it was the extraterrestrial equivalent of ordering a Chinese.
Significantly less well known is a cracking little puzzle platformer called Fury of the Furries, a game that you may be disappointed to learn isn't about people in dog costumes angrily yiffing each other. A spaceship containing a crew of tiny tribbly fellas called Tinies, yes that's what they're called apparently, crash lands on an odd planet. Then there's a bad guy for some reason, and a kidnapped king, and...
Look, the story isn't important. I mean honestly, who plays video games for the story?
No, the important part of the game is the game. You control your Tiny as you try to reach the end of each level using 4 abilities you can switch between at any time. You can shoot fireballs, dig, swim, or use a ninja rope to swing over gaps and chasms. You won't always have access to each skill in any given level, and you can have skills given to you or taken away by passing through the appropriately coloured field. There are coins too, and collecting 100 rewards you with an extra life, as any fool know. It's very challenging and at times rage-inducing, but it's a hell of a lot of fun, the sort of thing you might get if you threw Lemming-style power-ups into Super Meat Boy.
The game was released in Europe for the PC, the Mac, the Amiga and the CD32, and all of these versions are basically the same, although the Mac version has slightly more colourful graphics, and the music varies between platforms. Now personally, I think the Amiga version has the better music, but then again, I am terribly biased in favour of the Amiga, so I'm not a reliable source for any thing, ever. Anything. Oh, you shouldn't even be watching this show.
At some point, Callisto head honcho Nicholas Galm, seen here trying to get his hand unstuck from his arse by putting his other hand up his arse, got it into his head that Fury of the Furries could be sold to Namco as a Pac-Man spin-off. Calls were made, meetings were held, and in 1994, years after we'd learned to immunise our children against Pac-Man fever, Pac-in-Time was released onto an unsuspecting public. It's more or less the same game in the same way that Super Mario Bros. 2 is basically the same as Doki Doki Panic, but instead of a magical ball of fur, you take on the role of lovable 80s video game icon Pac-Man, who's been sent hurtling back through time by the Witch Queen and has to use his famed skills as a swinging, swimming, fireball-launching digger to make his way back home to the wife and kiddies.
Just goes to show what you can accomplish when you kick your crippling pill addiction.
Almost every change made to the game was superficial. They changed the tiny sprite into Pac-Man and the coins into pills, but there are enemies and statues that look like Tinies that they didn't even bother tweaking.
Pac-in-Time never made it to the Amiga, probably because by 1994 the only people who still gave a fuck about the machine were Team 17 and, well, me probably, but it did get released, or I should say re-released, for the PC and the Mac. It also found its way onto 2 other systems, the Game Boy and the Super Nintendo.
The Game Boy version is astonishingly an almost pixel-perfect port of the original, containing more or less the entire game in 4 wonderful shades of green. The screen size is obviously smaller, which makes it a little bit more difficult to play, but as the game already features some small sprites, it sits right at home on the big grey brick.
The Game Boy version is an almost perfect handheld game. It's challenging, it's fun, and it strikes just the right balance of frustrating but charming. It uses a password system because, you know, Game Boy, but it's a solid game and something of a forgotten gem.
The Super Nintendo version, however, is an entirely different beast. Being unfamiliar with Nintendo's hardware, Callisto opted not to port the original but to instead develop a brand new game that uses the same base mechanics. The Super Nintendo version has its own look and feel, features a different set of levels altogether, and changes some of the core elements of play. Not a bad idea, especially considering the tiny sprites and simple animation of the original weren't necessarily SNES friendly, but this version suffers one minor flaw. It's shit.
You know, it's possible my fondness for the original has clouded my judgment, but the Super Nintendo version just isn't anywhere near as much fun. The level design is convoluted and messy, and making the sprites twice the size doesn't help at all.
Probably the biggest change in the Super Nintendo version, aside from the entire fucking game, is that the pack pills aren't just an optional collectible anymore. Now you have to collect them all to open the exit. You'll also find ghosts floating around some levels, and collecting the larger power pellets will make the ghosts edible. This makes the game feel more a part of the Pac-Man universe, but it's hampered by the fact that the wonky level design and chunky sprites make getting the fat yellow fuck onto high up ledges and almost out of reach locations preposterously difficult.
Trying to get around in this game is like making a post about Obama on Facebook and expecting an elderly relative not to leave a racist comment afterwards. It's a nice idea, but it's never going to happen.
It's interesting to note that the success of Pac-in-Time essentially birthed an entire range of spin-off titles. Pac-Man World, Pac-Man Rally, Pac-Man Fever, Pac-and-Roll, Pac-Pix, Pac-Dix, Pac-Pox, Pac-Nuts and Tic Tacs all owe their existence to Pac-in-Time.
So, you've heard all about the game and now you want to play it. How can you do that? Well, you can't. It's out of print, so you're basically fucked. See you next week.